Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about one of at least my favorite topics, which is the Kalam Cosmological Argument. This is an argument that shows that a creator God exists. My name is Dr. Engineer. I'll be your host for this discussion. I do want to warn you that this is not intended to be an introduction to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. First, some preliminary information. The content of this presentation is strictly the opinion of the participants. I do want to point out these discussions we're going to have are extremely hard-hitting and frank. Parental discretion and mature adult behavior is advised. Unlike what happens in some of the internet chat rooms, we want adult behavior. Any mistakes, omissions, or errors are the fault of the presenter, namely me. So this is intended to be a multi-hour discussion around the Kalam Cosmological Argument. It's going to be in-depth. It's going to look at science, history, and logic in terms of how all three of those things support the argument. You might think of this as being a discussion you would have in an undergraduate or graduate type of college setting. That doesn't mean you have to be a college student to listen to it. It's just to say that the material that's going to be presented here is intended to present the Kalam Cosmological Argument in the strongest light, as well as to explain some of the more difficult concepts. A lot of people misunderstand this argument because they have not taken the time to actually consider what some of the terms mean, to think about some of the implications, and to just look at it from beginning to end. This is a very strong argument for the existence of a creator God. And one of the things I did wrestle with is there are some people who raise very technical objections to this argument. I looked at many of these arguments. I look at new ones that come out. I have not found a technical argument that would cause the Kalam to fail, basically, as an argument. But we still need to answer objections, and there are some very technical objections related to cosmology and the Big Bang and all these other things. I do want to state up front that none of them that I've seen hold water, but I couldn't fit them into this presentation. This session is going to be long enough, and to be honest with you, it's only the die-hard anti-Kalam people who would hold to some of these positions. So for most of us who aren't as die-hard, or some might say more reasonable, that additional content just wouldn't mean much. So I'm going to split this into two topics. One today, which is going to be the in-depth examination of the Kalam, and the second would be answering the very technical objections. From an agenda, this agenda is a little bit deceiving because it's going to be pretty well packed. This first session, which we're going to do now, is what I'll call the preliminary. It's laying the groundwork for dialoguing about this. If you're convinced already that the Kalam doesn't make sense and you're looking to find an excuse or to find something that is said wrong here, well, you want to go through this section, but most importantly, you want to figure out, are you just going to waste your time? Because if you've already decided the Kalam won't work, then why bother? Now, if you're somebody who's wondering, does the Kalam make sense? What is the Kalam argument? What are some of the terms or definitions, or how does it fit together? Well, this is for you. But if you're an atheist bigot, then you may as well not waste your time. If you're somebody who's seeking answers to tough questions, then this is for you. I do recommend you go through the preliminary section. This is important to set sort of the foundation, not only for this discussion, but for talking about these really tough things in general and what do they mean. We just don't want to discuss this for the sake of having a philosophical discussion. It's really important if God does exist because, there are certain implications. But we need to get there. We need to be able to talk about that. And that's what this preliminary section is about. The introduction introduces the Kalam. We'll look at an overview of the three premises, and I bring them here. The universe had a beginning is the first premise. The second premise is the beginning event was caused. The third premise is the cause for the beginning event was personal. Each of those will have a separate discussion around them. We'll also look at a section on how to dialogue about some common objections. We won't answer all of them, but there are common ones that come up frequently because of misunderstandings. We'll take a Greg Koukl tactics approach to this, where we'll answer a question with a question. And lastly, we'll summarize the whole session. Who am I? Well, I have a PhD in systems and computer engineering. And why does that make me, someone who can talk about this? Well, actually, while doing my dissertation and research, I had to be involved in things like trace theory, philosophy of time, and queuing theory. So I had to delve into philosophy of math, very heavy mathematics. So I'm pretty well schooled with a bunch of tools in the toolbox. I am a scientist, and I would submit that I'm a scientist because I published in international refereed scientific conferences and journals. I've been awarded over 15 patents. I'm not saying that to toot my own horn. I'm saying that I do have a background in science. I do know what science is. I do practice science. And so if someone were to say, well, he's just philosophizing, I would say, no, I actually show that this topic meshes with both science and philosophy. I have taught in universities. I'm currently employed in industry. I have a very fortunate position to be able to lead research while having an industry job. I also want to point out that, yes, I am a Christian. I'm a first-generation Christian. I've been a Christian for a little over 30 years now. I've studied apologetics, philosophy, and theology extensively. You might say that if I could, I would have gotten a job as a philosopher in apologetics, but it doesn't pay so well. I am what's called a volunteer apologist for Reasons to Believe. Reasons to Believe is an organization that looks at how science and the Bible mesh together, how they support one another. And as part of being a volunteer apologist, I do have to be knowledgeable in cosmology. As well, this particular argument, I've studied it for over 20 years. And when I say I've studied it, I mean I've read the popular material, as well as I've gone and read the academic material. I've read the academic books. I've also read the academic journals. And so what I'm going to do is take 20 years of discussion and review, and I'm going to pack it together in a way that it should be easily understood, or as most easily understood as it could be. I have to acknowledge that much of this material is from other sources: William Lane Craig, Jim Sinclair, and J.P. Moreland. There's a bibliography that is a separate video of the books that have been part of this, or I've taken material from. I do not list the academic papers because, to be honest with you, I haven't kept track of them over the last 20 years. This is the preliminary discussion, and I want to talk about how we come to believe something. If we come to believe something in science, how do we do that? Well, there's sort of this scale, and you'll see where I'm going with this, but please give me a minute. It's unreasonable to believe something if the theory is wrong. And you can think of this as maybe a probability. You might say that, well, there's a 5% probability that this theory is right, and that's a very low number, so I think it's unreasonable to believe this theory. And we could call that theory to be in a defeated state. Now, what happens if, more evidence accumulates? Well, it's less reasonable to believe something. It's more reasonable to believe, but less reasonable to believe. It's more reasonable than being unreasonable, if that makes sense. If we're in state zero, where the for and against reasons for believing something are counterbalanced. If it's 50-50, 50% probability it's right, 50% probability it's wrong, well, then the theory is inconclusive. But if there's more evidence brought to bear, if some of the facts become stronger, and it becomes probable, let's say probable means there's a 65% that it's likely that the theory is true, Well, in this case, suspending judgment is okay, but you're starting to lean towards something that may actually be useful to believe. Well, we can be in the clear. What if it's 80% probably that something is true? In this case, suspending judgment is not wise. And then there's, let's call it state 3, where we're beyond a reasonable doubt. The theory is a clear winner, and suspending judgment now is unreasonable. So I bring this up because believing something is not a binary thing. It's not a thing where you say, oh, I 100% believe it, or I don't believe any of it. In some cases, you may grow in your belief. And I bring this up because there are people on the internet that say that it's an either-or situation. And we need to avoid extreme rigidity. And so the pro and con evidence for Christianity is not the choice of everything must be perfect to accept Christianity. You know, if you say everything must be perfect, then that is actually a hyper-skeptical, unreasonable expectation, because we're finite beings. We won't interpret everything properly all the time. We won't have all the knowledge all the time. And so, you know, on the internet, people say there are only two options. You accept it all because everything's perfect, or the other alternative is everything is not perfect, so nothing can be accepted. And the reason I bring this up is because we're going to talk about this argument, and we're going to see evidence. And some of this evidence you may feel is not perfect, but it's highly likely. And so, you know, based on the scale of belief, maybe highly likely is significant. Well, there's another option. When we talk about Christianity, or we talk about these kinds of arguments, the other option is there may be sufficient evidence to warrant the acceptance of Christianity, even in light of perhaps there being some missing knowledge or gaps in knowledge. So in summary, to accept Christianity, the evidence for Christianity must be stronger than the evidence against it. So that's a position. I think that's reasonable. When we talk about explanations, you know, when I'll talk to somebody about the Kalam, and I'll start using evidence, and I'll say, well, here are these facts which I consider evidence. They'll usually say, oh yes, but, you know, have you considered this? And a story they give me is not a refutation. An alternative explanation is not a refutation. And I just want to point that out, because rather than people in their minds when they're listening to this saying, oh yes, but it could have happened this way, well, that is, yeah, not really evidence. Let's deal with the evidence that's shown in the context it's shown. Let's take the argument seriously. But I just want to point out a couple things. There are 3 questions you need to ask with an explanation, and I expect you to ask this throughout this discussion. You can ask, is it possible? And when I mean possible, is it logically coherent? If people use words that together that don't really make sense, then it's not possible because it's logically incoherent. There may be contradictions in the concept, so look for contradictions. One example we have here is a married bachelor. Well, there's no such thing as a married bachelor because by definition bachelors aren't married, or a 4-sided triangle. As well, if something is possible, you have to ask, is it plausible? Because many things are possible but not plausible. So you want to look at all the facts and say, is it plausible? Is this a plausible explanation? And you may have several plausible explanations, in which case you want to pick the best explanation, the most probable one. And the most probable one needs to be more likely than the alternatives. Now, we also need to step back and realize that as human beings, we have assumptions. Some of those are hidden. As human beings, we have some prejudices, even though we may not realize we have them. In some cases, we've just accepted beliefs for some reason. And what we want to do is understand the reality around us in a way that is consistent. Well, that's more than just consistent. We want to build a consistent worldview. And when we talk about that, that's how are we going to investigate the world? What's the criteria? Well, I'm going to submit to you the following criteria. And when I say this is not just a criteria for examining the Kalam. I'd like to submit to you that this is a criteria for how you want to understand the world around you. Your relationships, your understanding of reality, your history. So let's look about the proposed criteria. One criteria is that there's consistency throughout our view of the world with few gaps. No internal contradictions. If there are contradictions, then we wind up with something that's illogical. It should be empirical, and that it should be grounded in measurable things and scientific adequacy. And it should mesh with science in general. You know, science is fluid, it changes. I'm a scientist, I know this, I've seen it, I've experienced it. So we shouldn't require everything to be in exact unity or correspondence with science. We just need it to be the bulk of it to be true, because science can change. It needs to be plausible in that it's logically reasonable. It needs to be embedded in history. It needs to be livable. And what I mean by livable is, the way we live should be consistent with our beliefs. Because if they aren't consistent, then in essence our life is being hypocritical. Our actions are hypocritical. And so what we propose to believe about the world or say about the world, we should act like we live that way. It can incorporate tradition. We shouldn't we shouldn't be snobs when it comes to the past. Tradition is not a bad thing. It should be aesthetically pleasing, and this is getting a little wishy-washy, but if you look at science, you'll find that a lot of the great scientific findings were found because of let's call it maybe not guesswork, but some sort of intuition about what looks good, what seems pleasing to the person. And the last one is what we see in the world around us may be in tension with what we want to believe. We don't want this is just the recognition that sometimes we don't want to believe something because we don't like the implications. But that doesn't mean it's not true if we don't like it. So this is the criteria I'd like you to apply to this argument. And one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is that there are some people on the internet who claim that you can only use science to know what's true. Well, as you can see, science is just one of the things, one of the tools in the toolbox we want to use, and that's what I want to bring out here. Use all the tools in your toolbox. So let's talk also about building a consistent worldview and talk about the world that we know of. So I believe that there was such a thing as a Big Bang, and time has proceeded since then. And we've seen matter coalesce out of the matter, galaxies and solar systems form. We have the Earth and the Moon. And then we had single cellular organisms and complex life, which is multicellular, and mankind eventually arrives. Mankind then creates civilizations. From the Christian standpoint, Israel and Jesus and the church occur, and then along comes science, just sort of a late addition to all of this. Well, we can use empirical data and scientific investigation going all the way back almost to the Big Bang. And we can go back as far as 10 to the minus 44 seconds. There's 10, that is a 0 followed by 43 zeros followed by a 1. So That's a very small amount of time from when the Big Bang happened to where we can actually detect stuff. But my point is, from time equals 0 to the Planck time, we can't know what happened. That's a mystery. And we will never know what happened, likely. But because there's a mystery in science, does that invalidate our scientific knowledge? The answer is no. Mysteries or gaps in knowledge don't mean something can't provide insight. And similarly with the Kalam or with Christianity, if there are mysteries in it, that doesn't mean we throw it all out. It just means there are mysteries. Now we can use historical analysis from when mankind begins. We have church tradition to build a worldview. But what about before the Big Bang? Is there anything we can say about that? And we certainly can't say something from science, because science deals with the universe, and the universe didn't exist prior to the Big Bang. But I'd like to submit that there are some things that are beyond physical. They're metaphysical. We'll call them metaphysical axioms, and you'll see them. And these are, in some sense, logical ways of knowing what is possible or what is not possible. So we can use that to know what happened before and after the Big Bang. So these are all elements that we want to use. These are tools in our toolbox when we come to look at the Kalam. So let's begin.